The idea of this presentation is to give you a bit of a background on some of the decision making involved. There is uncertainty not only for each of our own lives, but also for our church community and how it will operate. We all realize, thankfully, most of us are not infected, but most of us are affected in various, most of us, all of us are affected in a wide number of different ways. And we'll talk about some of those. We also, at this time, I would argue, need to remember time and time again that we have real inequalities how people are affected and frankly infected as well, and need to understand how justice moves through society in times of pandemics. We need to thank each other for the fact that we are protecting each other through social distancing, through washing hands. And that responsibility is not only to ourselves, but to society as a whole. But first of all, of course, we need to recognize the grace of God, the guidance and protection of our Lord during these difficult times. And I found this prayer to be helpful. It's not Thomas Cranmer by any means, but it does express one prayer to God in anxious times, and I'll lead you in it. Gracious God, champion of the universe, we so often fluff ourselves up. Aren't we the only creatures who compose masterpieces of music and art? Don't we govern ourselves, enrich ourselves, promote ourselves? Can't we dunk basketballs, bat baseballs, spike volleyballs? Aren't some of us masters of comic irony? Other creatures don't practice rocket science. We do. And yet, here we are, frightened by a thing so small it can't be seen under most microscopes. It's not even an animal or a plant. It's a virus, a mere parasite, dependent on our own living cells to replicate. And yet it has shuttered our schools, canceled our flights, emptied our churches. It has consumed the attention of our leading scientists, wrenched our politics out of shape, dominated our conversations, and scared the daylights out of us. We don't want to get sick, and we don't want to die. We are afraid, oh God, afraid of a microorganism, afraid of each other. Great and quiet source of peace, quiet our fears. We are wary, uncertain, strung tight. Quiet our fears. We have no idea what the future will bring, but we do know you will be in our future to hold us there. We cannot quiet ourselves, oh God. We cannot comfort ourselves, cannot heal ourselves, cannot help ourselves. And all we can do is wash our hands and keep our distance. Our rocket science is no good to us for this threat. O God, great and quiet source of peace, quiet us, your anxious ones, and let us cling for comfort to your suffering Son, Jesus Christ. Gather us under his wings. Remind us that he suffers with us, but he's also the great physician. In him, let us not be afraid. Please, let us not be afraid. Amen. So, as I mentioned, and in that realm, how do we operate under this knowledge of God's mercy? To me, as an epidemiologist, the first thing that we need to understand is that medicine is very different now. Most of our medical system has been based on what is best called me medicine. And we're now into we medicine, that it's not only our actions not only affect ourselves, but those around us. And the actions of those around us affect us. How do we work as a community to create a population that is protected and comfortable and functional? And we are not there right now. Another way of saying it is the subject of masks. And other than N95 masks, it is often not understood that the behavior of wearing masks is to protect others. We keep the disease within ourselves by using a mask. And the statement, I will wear a mask for you and you will wear a mask for me, is a statement of community. In some ways, it's a minor passing of the peace that we can do in community by creating protective mechanisms. Some have called the stages of control of the disease the hammer and the dance. This is from an article that was published in mid-March saying that we do have a hammer and we have a limited number of tools currently in place to control the disease. And the big one is what has been called social isolation. And we all know the costs associated with that. Not only is it economic, we have personal effects. Society has had effects. There are changes in politics. And we also understand that these effects will continue for a long time. And we need to understand that we cannot continue that social isolation forever. But as explained by our governor and others, we need to build up a set of tools that can replace the hammer. And that's called the dance. The dance is based on partial information. We fully do not understand how this disease is operating. And much of the initial investment has been not only in social isolation, but developing methods in our hospitals, in our governments to make some of those strategies. And it's called a dance because errors will be made, misjudgments will be made. And there needs to be the opportunity not only to move forward, but to move back when those errors occur. I call it stuttering moves to a new normal. And at some point, we have that new normal. And we also need to recognize that different states, different communities, not only full states, but cities, counties, and the like, are in different positions to be able to move forward and not simply focus on basic control mechanisms. And again, we should thank each other because Minnesota has shown some real capabilities to lower the transmission rate and provide methods to allow some of those first steps in the dance to occur. But we also need to recognize that even during outbreaks, some of the measures are not that accurate. And this is an example of data out of a community in Italy. And sorry, I did not translate the title, but it essentially says the blue line is the regular expected mortality in this area of northern Italy. Secondly, we have a green line, which is the reported mortality that occurred in that community due to the coronavirus. But the red line is a line of total reported mortality in that community. which suggests that either there is more direct effects in disease of coronavirus causing deaths, or there's concomitant effects that we simply have not understood at this time. And both can occur. I think I mentioned in the last Sunday school class, Ebola virus um, probably killed more people due to malnutrition than it did due to the direct effects of the disease. We also see differences between countries as far as the um, overall case fatality rate or the number of people who die who are reported to be infected. That can be due to the measurement and the limitations of availability of, of testing methods and reagents for those tests. But it's also too important that different countries have different profiles of people at risk. Italy is much higher than China in terms of the mortality rate of those reported infected. And probably quite a bit of it is due to two factors. Number one is that people are a higher proportion of people are older within the Italy population. And secondly, those who are older have more likelihood of surviving other factors that may not be addressed as directly within China. So that combination of age and concomitant factors are an important consideration. The other thing to point out, and this aligns with the question on how people are dying, is this is from New York, a report from The Economist, that heart conditions are increasing within the population, not only in those that are infected by the coronavirus, but it also appears there are other factors increasing the proportion of people who see heart-associated diseases. This may be due to viral effects, but as can be imagined, there can also be other factors and stressors in people's lives that increase the number of cardiac arrest deaths and the like. And so there's a number of different factors to understand. And frankly, some of this information is simply being collated and reported at this time within the epidemiology community. If we talk about the dance and the next steps, realizing the great cost to society, to individuals, that socialization has created, we need to understand how to move forward. We have this list of drivers for that decision. And it varies from whether or not treatment is successful, whether or not there are methods, especially methods that can control the level of virus within a person. We need to monitor and understand when cases are starting to reduce, showing that current control methods are successful. We need to understand whether or not compliance is continuing at a high level. Social distancing, sanitation, washing of hands is going to probably be a long-term strategy. We need equipment, masks, other protection methods. We need testing, not only for the virus, but antibodies showing that a person has been infected and in most cases eliminated the disease and hopefully has protection against future infections. This testing also can can be used to understand overall what's happening in the population to create better strategies of control. Most of the testing has been focused greatly on those who are sick and those who are at risk. Some of you may have seen at the announcement of increased testing within Minnesota. That is what I consider to be a great success, in part because we have an opportunity to do some of these other testing methods, but also some of the restriction on testing, especially the availability of reagents and other mechanisms, have been answered by using new testing methods. And those of us within the infectious disease community, including in my own college, the veterinary school, have created quite a discipline around especially antibody tests to address some of the concerns about validity in the press. What will occur over a long period of time is controlling group size, understanding how many people we can put in contact with each other at the same time. And I should add as well that there will need to be records of those people meeting together so that contact tracing can occur. In some cases, we'll be redesigning facilities, creating barriers to create smaller group sizes, or in some cases, understanding some of the methods that airflow can possibly create problems in transmission as well. We will continue and increase the amount of contact tracing. Once the system is not overwhelmed with too many cases, we can start understanding and following those at risk and subdivide the population. There are questions about digital tracing, having records of who you meet and following phones or other methods to do that. There are legal questions about that, and they are correct. But frankly, public health doesn't always do things in a way that respects classic individual rights. We have natural immunity. As mentioned before, antibody tests will be able to monitor those with natural immunity due to exposure to the disease. And finally, in the future, we should have vaccines, but even those vaccines may not create full protection, but only partial protection that probably will need some or all of these other factors to be put in place at the same time. And really, the best expectation is strategies in this dance will involve all of the above factors. And it is a complicated set of decisions to make and a complicated set of changes in society that need to be monitored, require a discipline, and above all, require buy-in by our communities. Governor Walz presented this slide this week. It's another way of presenting some of the factors in play. And as you can imagine, there are safe practices and responses along the bottom that need to occur at the individual level and also at the government or community level, and those will continue. The interesting parts are those dials or slides that will be adjusted in the workplace, in social settings, and in school settings. And workplace settings have already been modified this week to start that dance. And as mentioned, what is needed is what is preferred, for instance, in workplace, is highly predictable and smaller sized settings or groupings. In other words, the same people meeting together day after day. And so an office is an easier place to manage than a mall, even though the group size can be the same. Likewise, in social settings, we're currently at stay at home, moving up to small family gatherings, recognizing that again, this is a highly predictable and smaller size setting. You may notice that places of worship are placed at a point above small family gatherings. And yet the question is, how predictable and what size are those gatherings? Bars, restaurants, sporting venues, and concerts are less predictable and larger size. Likewise in school, we're at distance learning right now and moving beyond that. So another way of saying it is we start with physical distancing. We will be restructuring how we work, how society works. There will be engineering controls, physical barriers between people. There's administrative controls. How do we deliver materials? How do we share responsibilities without having contact? How do we utilize the personal protective equipment, such as non-medical masks? And all of those join together in creating a broader strategy. And churches, to address some of our immediate concerns, we need to recognize, and I thought this was rather blunt, and maybe "cuz" was misspelled, but Jesus and germs are everywhere. And we need to manage both of those in our strategy. And there are articles where churches have been major points of transmission when control measures are not in place. There's concerns about singing in close quarters and decreased ventilation. This quote from Infection Control Today calls it a petri dish or cell plate for viral growth. Some of you may have read about the choir practice who did practice social distancing, but in a small airspace, and they ended up with 45 infections, 3 hospitalizations, and 2 deaths. And there will need to be more understanding of what happens in these small communities. There are, and at the bottom, CNN has reported that 70 people at a church were infected with COVID-19. And so it's saying that we need to decrease the likelihood that people entering the church are infected. And when infected, when in retrospect an infection is recognized, there can be tracing, and hopefully the population of people that need to be traced is relatively small. Ed Setzer in Christianity Today laid this out this week. First, churches need to learn practical procedures and policies they will adopt moving forward. This will definitely include communication. It'll also include contingency plans and to remain flexible while this is a volatile scenario as society learns what works and what doesn't work. Finances will change. During this time of economic distress, there will be financial impacts on the church. And churches need to go through a reassessment of budgets, and we also, within our families, for for ourselves, need to understand what the potential effects can be and how and what they are, and work through them. Third, churches need to work through their ministry models. It includes corporate worship, small groups, next generation ministries, volunteering. We know they've all been disrupted, and their recreation is a hybrid, a combination, new methods, and churches, including ours, are going through that imagination. And finally, we need to understand our mission. More than ever, people are hurting, grieving, in need, and really asking deep questions about purpose, about death, about the truths in the world. And we have real opportunities there as individuals, as churches, to answer some of those, to allow for certainties to be presented. This is one verse that strikes me. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And perseverance will be needed. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but the mechanisms to go back to normal within the next year are unlikely to be available. Vaccines take a while to develop, to roll out, to be applied across a broad population and allow that population to become immune. We don't want everyone to experience the disease. And so we need to consider some of the long-term effects and experiences that we will have as Christians, as a church, and in the challenges we go forward. So I'm going to leave the discussion at this point. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask for questions and comments. I've got the chats and the Q&A open. I see Luke, you've raised your hand. Sorry, and I made an error in this. I cannot, oh boy. Luke, I'm going to, I can't get the audio working with raising hands. So if I could ask you to, and Dr. Guyton, I'll ask you as well to type your questions at this point. My apologies. I'm going to try set that up, but if you could either put it through either other means, I'd appreciate that. And in the meantime, I will try to figure out my error in this setup. And I apologize. Judy did make a statement in chat that her 83-year-old mother thanked her and expressed thanks for the young people willing to stay home and protect her and others at risk. And she noticed we are all at risk from infection, and that is an aspect we need to understand. Luke and Dick, can you type your question? I'm sorry. And I'm struggling with technology too. Luke had a question that, okay, I'm going to give up and simply rely on sharing. I think I set this up in the wrong manner. And so I'm going to rely on type questions. First of all, Luke asked first good question is, do you know if there are behavioral social scientists studying the effects of mass social isolation and how to mitigate the harm from that? And the answer is yes. I've seen a couple presentations on this. First of all, there are the overt dangers that are involved in isolating with people who are a threat, and events of social violence, domestic violence are increasing, and some of the responses from both the criminal justice system as well as from police are sometimes limited because of other problems or other priorities or restricted number of people involved. And beyond that, overall, that is one of the reasons why social groups should be increased with greater capability, with greater opportunities over the next little while. And that's one of the decisions that we need to make. If we experience that socialization as a real negative effect, can that community be widened to something that is repeatable and still restricted over a longer period of time? And that seems to be the main mitigation. The other one is simply waving, going on walks, saying hi to everyone, stopping at that 6 feet, asking how they're doing, belonging to a neighborhood, and sharing, frankly, over the internet as well. And realize people are affected in different ways. Some of those, yours truly, is more of an introvert and therefore not as affected. Richard Guyton said, WHO stated that immunity may not be identical with antibodies. What has happened in China and Italy in this regard? The simple answer is that, and you know it, Dick, antibodies are needed to eliminate the virus from the body. So if you're negative on PCR or to the viral test, something happened with your immunity in most cases. So at least there's a short-term effect, just mechanistically. The real question is, how long is it? There is evidence, especially out of China, that for some people it lasts a significant amount of time. But the testing hasn't been that available to allow us really to understand what the antibodies mean. And so WHO is saying that we don't have the evidence yet. But if we don't have immunity, we are totally dependent on a vaccine. And frankly, it makes a vaccine more difficult to create. Judy said, I got word yesterday that a Karen family of 5 in Worthington that comes to Messiah all tested positive for coronavirus the day I'd worked at the pork plant. And yes, some of the biggest within the Midwest, the biggest outbreaks are around Sioux Falls and in Noble County around Worthington, associated with very high levels of transmission within slaughter plants. And those need to be redesigned to be capable of limiting the spread of the disease. And frankly, errors were made in monitoring and understanding what was going on, and the lack of tests didn't help. Question is, Tim asked, will the slide set be available? Email me, Tim, if you'd like the slide set. This is being recorded and being put on YouTube as well. Joy asks, so has Messiah decided that we will not worship together again until a vaccine is developed? The simple question is no, that decision has not been made. And really the decision isn't being made by a church or frankly by a diocese. It's being made by our government. And I just put in an aside here that it is really important for us to work together and not second guess decisions that are made by our forms of governance. It does not allow control measures to be assessed, and it doesn't allow those who are particularly vulnerable, especially in our congregant settings, to be protected. And that's the challenge of medicine versus public health. That is a challenge in our lives. As mentioned, we'll be sharing Ed Stetzer's argument on Facebook. Judy mentions that domestic violence is a reason to call and check on our friends. And as she mentions, leaving a violent situation was specifically listed as a reason to be released from the shelter-in-place order. And as she mentioned, Messiah has already helped 2 young people leave in this sort of situation. And I guess it comes back to Luke's question as well. These are a very important and least understood set of stressors on our community. And we need to understand them in more detail, and we need to be open to those discussions on frustrations, on inability to operate under those restrictions. And hopefully this does give a level of honesty and understanding of each other and each other's needs, whether it be psychological, whether it be spiritual, whether it be economic, that we can work together as community. I'm going to leave you with this thought and allow us to prepare to meet together again in person one day, but also together online or in hybrid circumstances, that God is with us and we express God's presence in part through our presence as well in other people's lives. And I urge you, and I need to remind myself, to be that missionary in this time of difficulty. Thanks very much. I'm going to close it at this time. Apologize. Phyllis asked one question. just let me keep that. What are the guidelines for wearing masks when you are outside walking or biking, along with keeping social distance? There are not guidelines at this point in this state. And frankly, there has not been a good assessment of the risk. It may occur in the future. It may be especially important during different types of weather. But at this point, keeping social distance is the main concern. Biking and walking, especially biking, you shouldn't be biking 6 feet apart from each other anyway, unless you're in a family group. But speed and physical exertion probably means that distance should be longer. But again, let's rely on each other, realizing the challenges in place. Thanks very much.